Dungeons & Dragons is a highly popular fantasy role-playing game where your options are limited only by your imagination, a roll of the dice, and an incredibly lengthy and complex set of rules. That's a 19! But while the character creation system offers a lot of different options for playing melee weapon users or spellcasters, it's traditionally been a little bit more limited when it comes to options for archers. But all that might be about to change, because this year they've just released the new 2024 Player's Handbook, full of revamped options for every single class. So in this video I'm going to go through it, talk about the new options for ranged characters, what it means for different types of builds, and of course have a little bit of a rant about Ranger. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name's David, aka Blumenek. I'm an archer, a trick shooter, and a performer, but I'm also a D&D player, a DM, and a massive nerd. I'm going to go through every single class and try and create a build with each of them, even the ones that don't make any sense. Where possible, I'll use the subclasses and the species options that are presented here, but I will also talk about how you could improve these builds by bringing in some older subclasses in some cases. And because of who I am, I'm also going to show you what I think combat with each of these builds would look like. It's not all going to be perfect, and many of the ideas are aiming for fun rather than optimization. But there should be plenty of options to inspire you for your own D&D games. One of the comments that I get quite a lot when talking about fantasy tropes is to stop taking things so seriously. And they're right, because fantasy characters should be able to do things that would be difficult or impossible in real life. But they're also wrong, because the best fantasy stories are the ones that do take things seriously, where magic isn't just an excuse to explain things, but a tool with its own rules and limits. Because if you don't have those limits, then you lose out on those awesome moments
when someone overcomes them,
even if it's just for comic effect. Now, this doesn't mean that the story itself has to be serious, and many of the best ones aren't. But the more consistent you can make your character and setting, then the further off the rails you can go before anyone suspects you of making it up as you go along. Even if you really are. And if you're a writer yourself, or a GM, or even just a player, World Anvil is chock full of tools to help you keep track of things like locations, character identities, relationships, abilities, and all of those things that help to ground your fantasy world and make it feel consistent. So take your fantasy stories seriously, or not, with World Anvil. Before I go through the classes, I'm going to go through some of the other character options so that you've got those in your head. The first one is species. Species has replaced races for the term for different types of being that you can play in Dungeons & Dragons. And the main thing I want to talk about for archer builds is that they've done away with any particular species that have weapon proficiencies. So it's no longer the case that playing an elf inherently gives you an advantage if you want to be able to use a bow with a class that doesn't specialize in them. There are a couple of really cool options and a couple of really niche options that can be really good in this setting. The first one is High Elf. So High Elf has the option to have any wizard cantrip. And that wizard cantrip can be tied to an ability score of your choice, which is crucial for this guide because True Strike has been changed. It no longer gives you advantage on your next attack, but instead lets you make an attack with a weapon that you're proficient with using your spellcasting ability stat. And while Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock and Wizard all have this at the start, if you're playing a Wisdom spellcaster like Cleric or Druid, the only way you can get this to use your stat is by playing as a High Elf. Sorry, I got this wrong. It also works for Magic Initiate. It also has access, as they go along, to Misty Step. So if you're a spellcaster anyway and you wouldn't have had that spell, it's a really nice one to have in the bank as a ranged character. But one of the more surprising entries into great species to play as an archer is the Goliath, because the new Goliath gets a bunch of different options depending on which type of giant they're descended from, and several of them trigger on a weapon attack, ranging from dealing additional damage, to slowing your enemies, to knocking them prone. So if you want cool trick shot options and additional damage baked into your species, that's a really good way to start. And even if you don't, going for a cloud giant background allows you to teleport a few times a day, which is never not helpful. Other notable instances are that halflings still have their ability to reroll a natural 1, which is very handy, and Asimark and Sproutwings fly about and deal additional damage for a minute, which is a very useful thing in a clutch situation if you want to stay out of your enemy's reach. Beyond that though, pretty much every species has something useful that they can do, so pick your favourite and run with it. And the next thing I want to cover is backgrounds. Now these are a little bit different from how they were in the 2014 rules because the ability score improvements that you get at base have been taken from the species and put in the background, which I love because it means that species are not tied into particular playstyles anymore. But I hate because now backgrounds are tied into specific playstyles. And not only are your ability scores tied to your background, but so too are your skill proficiencies, your tool proficiencies, potential for languages, a background feature, and your origin feat. Now, origin feats are a new category of feats which mostly existed in the old game, but now they are specific ones which you can get at the start of the game. There's an option in the handbook for using older backgrounds and revamping them. So if your old background doesn't have a feat attached and doesn't have ability scores attached, you can choose which ability scores and which origin feat you want to add to those, which allows you that customization option. And that brings me on quite nicely to the topic of feats. Not those ones. Feats in the new 2024 rule set have been changed a little bit. The vast majority of feats are now half feats, which means they get at least one bonus to one ability score of your choice. Several of them have been changed and moved about, so I'll talk about how that affects the archer meta. The big one is Sharpshooter. Now, back in the day, Sharpshooter used to allow you to take a normal shot and reduce your accuracy while also increasing your power to deal additional damage. That is gone. It no longer has that option, and nor does Great Weapon Master. So all the builds that used to rely on getting as many attacks using Sharpshooter as possible no longer exist, which for my money is fantastic because it changes the meta and allows you to be a little bit more varied with the options that you take. The new version of Sharpshooter is both more versatile and a lot more boring because it just removes most of the cases where you've had disadvantage. So you no longer have disadvantage from shooting within 5 feet of an enemy, or from shooting outside your weapon's normal range. And if your target's partially hidden behind an object, you can ignore that too. So to be honest, at that point, apart from ammunition, you might as well just be using a ridiculously long melee weapon. Other useful feats for archers include Fey Touched, which gives you access to that lovely Misty Step spell, Speedy, which makes it harder for enemies to land opportunity attacks, and weirdly, Great Weapon Master, which still allows you to cleave through enemies with melee weapons, but it now also has a flat once per turn damage bonus that applies to any heavy weapon, including longbows and heavy crossbows. So if you don't need the extra ability score, or you're wanting to boost strength anyway, and you use a longbow or a heavy crossbow, then that can be a really nice way to bump up your average turn damage. Oh, and of course, Crossbow Expert still does its thing where it makes pistol crossbows faster than any other ranged weapon in the game, which I still really don't like. The only thing they've changed to make it slightly harder is that you now need 2 of them to be able to have that effect, instead of just fanning the hammer somehow. And finally, the last thing that I want to talk about is a new feature called Weapon Mastery. Now, not everybody gets this, it's mostly restricted to martial classes, but it gives those classes an extra thing that each type of weapon does. So for bows and crossbows, this is mostly limited to the options Vex and Slow. So longbows and light crossbows both deal slow, which means that on a hit, an enemy's speed is reduced by 10 feet. It doesn't stack, so you can only do this once per turn, so it's a situational but kind of fun feature. Vex, on the other hand, which is available to pistol crossbows and short bows, is really useful for certain builds because after dealing damage to a target, your next attack against that target before the end of your next turn has advantage. It doesn't even have to be with the same weapon, and it doesn't specify it's only once per turn. So if you're able to keep consistently landing hits, you can have advantage on every single attack. This is phenomenal for rogues. Absolutely fantastic, because they will get their sneak attack way more reliably using these types of weapons. The other one that I haven't mentioned is heavy crossbows. Now, I don't have an example of one of these, but if they hit, they can push an enemy back 10 feet, which is phenomenal for getting out of that danger zone. I'm actually really jealous that longbow got slow instead of push, because there's something really, really cool, especially if you're able to shoot within 5 feet of an enemy, to just shooting them with an arrow and watching them yeeted backwards. And then you're no longer going to provoke an opportunity attack, you can just go. And that's it really. I've done origins, including species and background, I've done feats, and I've spoken about the True Strike spell. So on to classes! And the 2024 rules don't have Artificer for reasons which I'm sure were important, so our first class to look at is Barbarian. Now, Barbarians are traditionally big, hulking warriors who disdain armor and use heavy weapons to strike powerful blows. They are not scrawny, skinny archers who shoot lots of arrows at a target. But they're also fast, primal warriors, and merging that with some kind of ranged weaponry would be a very, very fun type of build. Now, because of the vibe that they're trying to match, most of Barbarian's cool weapon features apply specifically to strength-based attacks. But unlike in the old player's handbook, they no longer mostly specifically require it to be a melee attack, which means that a ranged Barbarian is now a pretty viable option, as long as they stick to throwing their weapons. But if you do want to be a Barbarian with a bow, there are a couple of semi-decent options within the rules. The first one is Wild Heart. This subclass has replaced the old Path of the Beast and allows you to channel different animal spirits into animalistic movements and abilities. If you take the right options, you can disengage and dash on the same turn as a bonus action, and then because you're proficient with bows, you can proceed to make your attacks using a longbow or a short bow. It won't gain your rage damage bonus, but it's a pretty cool option. And later on you get Flight, which gives you even more space for that maneuvering. It's a low damage way to play a Barbarian, and you are at some points going to want to ditch the bow and just go old school. But there's a lot of fun to be had. The other, probably more viable option, rules as written, is the Zealot Barbarian. These warriors channel a holy fury through them, and the power of the gods flows into their attacks. And just like in the 2014 rules, the damage bonus that they get to their first attack each turn does not require a strength-based or melee weapon attack. Which means that they alone, of all the classes, have the option to play a divine holy warrior that channels additional radiant damage through their first attack, which, to be honest, has enough power to be worth an extra attack. The Zealot is probably less primal in how they move compared with the Wild Heart, preferring an upright stance and powerful strides, and when they draw their bow, I imagine they're more likely to use techniques found in heavy draw longbows than the kind of rapid snatching techniques that you'd see on someone a little bit more. But if your DM is willing to be lenient, both of these builds, and indeed many others, become a lot more viable if they let you use a strength-based longbow, maybe making some kind of warbow-based subclass, which I think the class is crying out for personally, and then suddenly they get option to their reckless attack and to their rage damage bonus, and it makes them into a much more powerful and dangerous archer. And if your DM doesn't allow that, tell them that you're using javelins and reflavor it in your head. After Barbarian, our next option is Bard. Bards are musicians, performers, and frequently nuisances who use the power of words, song, music, and other things to channel into powerful magics that alter the world around them. As many of you will already know, I love bards. I think they're a great class. I think that their options in their subclasses are phenomenal, and some of you will already know where I'm going by the end of this. But the good news for enjoyers of Bard Archery is that the 2024 Bard is still really good for using bows. Now, it's had a couple of changes, don't get me wrong, but the new Valor Bard is a huge improvement over the old one, not just for using bows, but for using weapons in general. They've gained the ability to use their weapons as a spellcasting focus, which was one of the best things that College of Swords had going for them. And they've gained the best thing about Blade Singers from the earlier rules, which are that when you get your extra attack, one of them can be a cantrip, which gives you loads and loads of versatility, because you could make one attack and then cast an illusion over there. You could do some kind of fancy blow flourish, which results in casting friends on somebody else and charming them. Or you could make a regular attack, then follow it up with a fancy true strike, allowing you to make 2 weapon attacks with the potential for bonus damage as it scales. But it's the level 14 feature that's the most exciting to me. Because just as with the old Valor Bard, this allows you to make a weapon attack as a bonus action after casting a spell. And this is phenomenal for flavor, because combine that with your ability to channel spells through your weapon, and it really gives the feel that it is the shooting of the arrow that causes the spell to happen. But there's another layer to it now, because the wording specifically states that this bonus action is triggered when you cast a spell with a casting time of 1 action. It doesn't say you have to use your action to cast a spell. And this is important because the level 6 feature states that when you use your extra attack, you can replace one of them with a cantrip that has a casting time of 1 action. So by my
cast True Strike with a casting time of 1 action, and then follow that up with your bonus action for 3 attacks, plus the bonus damage of True Strike every turn. So even when you're not using your action to do something incredibly fancy with a spell slot, you've joined the hallowed ranks of classes that are able to make 3 attacks consistently in a turn. And by the time that your True Strikes finish scaling, you get an extra 3d6, which is equivalent to making 3 attacks with a Hex or a Hunter's Mark on a target. And given the other stuff that you could do with your action includes, at level 20, casting Power Word Kill on 2 things at once, and then following it up with an attack, you get a lot of options for doing incredibly cool stuff. Wild versatility, and a really good bread and butter archery. So how would that look? Well, especially given that at least one of their attacks is going to be triggered by their charisma, they're going to have some really showy and flashy movements. Perhaps incorporating things like unnecessary rolls, acrobatics, or even dance techniques into their combat. So although Magical Secrets no longer gives them access to Swift Quiver, the fact that bards can now make an attack, cast Vicious Mockery, and then make a second attack puts them much higher up the list than they used to be, and makes it kind of hard to be mad. Next up, Cleric. Clerics are holy folk. Dedicating their lives to a chosen deity, they then go out and spread the word by mostly slaughtering vast numbers of things in their name. Sort of like an old-fashioned version of Christianity. Despite primarily being spellcasters, clerics are often expected to occupy a support role in the battlefield, which means they tend to be reasonably good with armor and are expected to wield weapons as well. And while this stereotypically resorts to things like blunt weaponry, there's no particular reason it couldn't also apply to a bow. The only problem has been that, as spellcasters, they're going to prioritize their wisdom first, and then possibly constitution before worrying about their weapon stat. But that's less of an issue these days. Because with the new True Strike rules, and the option to use wisdom by playing as a high elf, you can now play a high elf cleric who uses wisdom to shoot a bow. How that looks, I imagine, comes in the form of someone whose actual archery technique is not that phenomenal on paper, but they channel the power of their god. They use their faith to make the arrow that little bit better. Perhaps whispering a prayer as they're about to shoot, and the arrow flies much more accurately than it has any real right. The fact that that scales with level and gives them additional radiant damage merges really nicely with the regular cleric features, which give them additional radiant damage on attacks. So by the time you're hitting max level, yeah, you're only doing 1 attack with your action, but it's coming off your primary stat. You get your normal damage plus an additional 2d8 plus 3d6 radiant damage. It's not going to make you a DPS class or anything, but it is going to give you a reasonable excuse to crack out the bow. Subclass-wise, the most obvious one to go for is a Cleric of War. They get bonuses to their weapon attacks, so they can channel divinity to make something that misses much more likely to hit, and they can make attacks as a bonus action. But there's also the Trickster Cleric. They get their channel divinity, which lets them invoke duplicity, which essentially causes a little illusory double. So while I'm over here driving something mad, my illusory double's over here doing the same thing. At later levels, you can swap places with them, which is a great way to teleport out of danger before making an attack. This is a much more silly and whimsical approach to Cleric, who for my money acts all serious when necessary, but really can't help breaking out the tricks every now and then. And in combat, they're all about confusion, while still having all of the toolkit required to be a decent support role. And then there's Druid. In many ways, Druids and Clerics share similar vibes, but where a Cleric channels the power of a divine being, Druids channel the primal forces of nature itself. They are similarly primarily spellcasters, with some additional features that recharge on short rests, but in the Druid's case, those additional features take the form of being able to take animal shapes. And the new Druid is really exciting to me because it represents the first of these classes that has a significant improvement in its ability to play an archer. Because Druid always, to me, was crying out for a bow. They use primarily wooden weaponry and primitive styles, but they never had the option of using something like this, and were restricted largely to shillelagh and bonking things with a stick. But thanks to the True Strike exploit we mentioned earlier, the new Druid has a way to essentially shillelagh their bow, allowing it to run off, once again, their primary spellcasting stat, which is Wisdom. The Druid, to me, has a slightly less fancy posture, walks a little bit crooked, and when they use a bow, everything again looks a little bit off, but then you can see the power channeling through the string as the bow itself begins to maybe sprout and bloom, and some petals and leaves fly off on the shot. But even without True Strike, they now have a feature which can enhance their regular weapon attacks with an elemental form of damage. So it's clearly an intended feature that they will be better at using any kind of weapon. And depending which subclass you go down, you can enhance this still further. If you want your ranged weapons to mostly be what you use when you are out of melee and have a decent melee backup, then going for Circle of the Moon is really, really useful. Because now you can transform into a horrendous bear, maul the heck out of everything, and then change back when you're ready. But in the meantime, you've got a teleport ability very similar to Misty Step, except that once you've teleported out of danger, you now get to make an attack with advantage. But as before, my favourite Druid subclass is the Circle of the Stars. Because instead of changing into an animal, you can use your wild shape to take on a starry form. And the Archer form can use their bonus action to make a ranged spell attack, which takes the form of a magical arrow every turn while it's active. Which is a phenomenal boost, especially because you're already using Wisdom for your primary attack. For me, I would flavour this as the Druid themselves making one shot from a static position, while behind them, a spectral form, possibly slightly larger, makes its own bow shot in tandem. And then when you're not wanting to use your bow, you can still have access to that feature while, I don't know, crashing a tidal wave down on your enemies or uprooting the earth beneath them. It's a very powerful and very fun subclass with a lot of versatility. But what about Fighter? Fighters, as the name suggests, are good at fighting. It's kind of their thing. They can pretty much wield anything however they like, as long as they've got the stats for it. So it makes sense that they're one of the better classes to use a bow. Naturally, they make heavy use of the new Weapon Mastery feature, and at higher levels they can even swap out the current Mastery feature for slow, sap, or push. So at that point, you probably want a weapon whose natural feature is Vex, and then you change where you aim, so you can hit the legs for a slowing shot, or the arms for a sapping shot, or the torso for a pushing shot. Just like in the 2014 rules, the fighter gets more attacks per turn than anyone else at high levels, hitting 3 at level 11 and 4 at level 20. And they have the option to action surge to do it all again, which means that fighter of all of the classes is the one most likely to use unusual speed shooting techniques, probably starting off with something relatively simple and classic, and then progressing to something with multiple arrows in the hand as they get to a higher level. Sadly, we haven't yet seen an updated version of the Arcane Archer, which would be really nice if they could make that, good. But in the meantime, the Battle Master gives you a lot of versatility for your Archer-based characters. It's the main trick-shooting Archer build that you can find, and they probably focus on aiming at slightly different parts of an enemy, building on what the fighter already has to create special effects, maybe even doubling up on arrows or using trick arrows to create specific things that can disarm or knock an enemy prone or something like that. Expect to see someone whose quiver has a bunch of the weird-shaped arrowheads in it, just for the sake of messing around and creating extra effects. It means that you can play something of a support role using prone or disarming effects against particularly troublesome enemies, while still being a classic damage-dealing archer character. But if armor isn't your thing, maybe you'd prefer monk. Like the fighter, monks are warriors. But while the fighter is more likely to rely on weaponry and armor to achieve their goal, a monk is more likely to rely on skill and martial arts to do what they want to do. The 2024 monk has had huge upgrades. They deal more damage, they have more features that they can use without spending their new focus points, and their subclasses have all taken a huge bump. This puts them in the slightly unusual position of being the only class in the new player's handbook that is both significantly better and significantly worse when it comes to playing archer builds. Because unlike the 2014 build with the addition of Tasha's Cauldron, there's no particular way to use a bow as a monk weapon. So although monks are proficient with simple weapons, which include short bows, if you've elected to use your short bow in combat, you're now no longer able to use your flurry of blows or your martial arts as a bonus action. On the other hand, You can now disengage or dash as a bonus action for free, and you can do both of them at once if you spend a focus point. So your ability to get out of an enemy's threat radius with cunning distractions and rolling movements is a lot better than it ever was. But because your bow is not a monk weapon, and because your monk weapons and unarmed strikes now scale faster than they did previously, you're very quickly going to feel like you're not doing enough damage with this, compared with throwing a knife. If we're going to stick with rules from this book, then probably the best subclass to take for an archer is the Way of Shadow. These are stealthy monks that have roguelike qualities. They're like moving in the darkness, teleporting from one patch of shadow to another, generally causing trouble through being difficult to see. The huge buff that they've taken is that when they cast darkness using focus points, they can now see in that magical darkness. It's a tried and true tactic that warlocks used to use, but now available to monks. But the big thing that will determine whether it's effective to be an archer monk using the new rules is Kensei. Kensei is a monk subclass from the older rule set, and in theory, the new rules are intended to be backward compatible, which means if you're willing to accept that a bunch of the terminology needs changing around, then you could perfectly well play one. And the Kensei was a monk who specializes in weapons, so it was perfectly valid for them to choose a short bow or even a long bow as a monk weapon, which gives you access to all the new features, scaling up to 1d12 at higher level, and crucially, allowing you to stunning strike through your weapon. So if you channel ki into a particularly powerful monk shot, hit the enemy and they fail their saving throw, then they are stunned as vibrations resonate around their body, or you clock them in the head with the back of the arrow, depending how magic you want to make it look. Personally, I would love to see an upgraded version of Kensei. The Kensei shot has always felt a little bit weak for the damage that it gives you compared with your other bonus action options, and the ability to gain extra defense by not using your monk weapon has always felt a bit stupid. If I was going to homebrew it and change it myself, I'd probably just swap those two features for the two Tasha's Cauldron features, one of which lets you spend key points to make a monk weapon attack more accurate, and the other of which lets you make a monk weapon attack as a bonus action after spending a key point in your action, because they gel really nicely and let you get more use out of your monk weapons. Now, in terms of shooting style, a monk archer is actually really interesting. The Kensei brings to mind ideas of Japanese Kyudo archery, which uses an obscenely long draw length somewhere around here, which for obvious reasons I can't demonstrate with this bow and this arrow. But monks in D&D have the defining trait of being fast, and Kyudo's defining trait is that it's very slow and very measured. So personally, given that the monk is managing to get 2 attacks off and still have time to run in and kick someone in the head 3 times, I would probably have them use a faster technique. They probably wouldn't keep lots of arrows in their draw hand, given that they're then going to be wanting to punch someone with it and they don't get to use piercing damage. But they might keep them in their bow hand, which allows them to relatively quickly knock and shoot before running in and doing whatever it is they're going to do. And whether they keep the arrows in the hand or in a quiver, the monk is probably the most likely to do on-the-fly moving shots, parkour-style rolling shots, and even shooting sometimes from mid-air, as they maximize the amount of movement they can get in their turn. And then there's Paladin. Paladins are holy knights who wear armor and smite their enemies by channeling divine energy through their weapon attacks. But despite being proficient with all weaponry, they've never been particularly good at using bows. And the new Paladin is no exception. In fact, it's probably the only class in the entire book which is just blanket worse at using bows than it used to be. Because at least some of the smite spells used to work with ranged weapons as well as melee, but they've all now been changed so that that's no longer the case. The new Paladin is definitely somebody that uses a bow while their enemy's out of range, and then immediately switches to their preferred melee backup and charges into battle. As such, they're one of the builds that is most likely to benefit from Great Weapon Master's bonus to longbow attacks. And then you double down on that tactic by playing Oath of Ancients and making your first attack with Ensnaring Strike, using what is probably a very by-the-book technique that you learn during training. And then when the attack hits, a bunch of vines wrap around them, leaving you free to charge in and smite the heck out of them. It's not my greatest archer build, but it gives you a reason to use your bow, a decent damage boost to your attack, and of course, lets you play to your strengths. Tactic-wise, this paladin shoots like a target archer, placing their arrow very carefully, standing their feet very stably, drawing back the shot, releasing, and then beginning their charge afterwards. But what, I hear you cry, of the ranger? Far from the hustle and bustle and cities, amidst the trees and the creatures, dwells the... you get the idea. Rangers are the archetypal nature-based archer. They live out in the wilderness, they forage for survival, they hunt for food, and they use bows most of the time. They are one of the best archer classes, and with good reason, because they are seemingly the only class that was actually designed with archers in mind. And just like the paladin, I find them deeply disappointing. But for different reasons, because while the paladin is disappointing because it's a very effective class that would feel really cool to have some kind of holy archer avenger type, and they know this because there's a picture of one in the goddamn book, the ranger is disappointing because it is one of the only classes that was previously considered weak that hasn't been significantly improved. That's not to say it hasn't been improved at all, and it is quite a good class in the new book. But it has some problems. So if you want to hear a ranger rant, tune in for the next couple of minutes. If you want to skip it, that's fine too. My biggest issue with the ranger is Hunter's Mark. Now, Hunter's Mark's a perfectly good spell. It's a first level spell, very similar to Hex, requires concentration. You mark a target with it, and it gains an additional effect, but also every attack that you make deals an additional 1d6 damage. Great, lovely, fine. The problem is that somewhere along the line, someone has decided that this is the balance feature that makes rangers effective. That additional d6 damage on every attack means that they don't get anything like, say, what Paladin gets, where they later on get an extra d8 on every attack without requiring any concentration. In fact, so much so have they agreed that this is the balance feature of the ranger that they've made it the core concept of the new ranger build. You get it at first level, and you get free uses of it. Extra free uses that you can use throughout the day of this first level spell. It requires concentration. So later on you get features which mean that your concentration can't be broken by taking damage. Fantastic. It means you can keep it going for longer. You get a lot of damage out of this spell for a first level spell, don't get me wrong. At further levels, you get advantage against the target that's marked with it, and then the capstone feature, the level 20 feature, the feature that you get at the same time that other people are getting +4 to 2 different crucial ability scores, or gaining the ability to cast a 9th level spell on 2 enemies at once, is that your damage die for your Hunter's Mark switches from d6 to d10. So they are aiming for you to use this first level spell from first level all the way up to level 20, and actually punishing you for not using it by removing several of your other high level features if you don't have it up. The problem is that rangers are half casters, and a chunk of their balance actually as a build comes from the fact that they have access to a whole bunch of different spells. The majority of those spells are concentration spells, so you cannot use them at the same time as Hunter's Mark. Which is just bad design. I don't care if it means that they're unbalanced if they're using Hunter's Mark at the same time as something else. If that's a problem, don't make Hunter's Mark their core feature. If you want something to be the core feature of a class, they should be able to use it in addition to their other features. It's like making Barbarian a half caster but still making it so they can't cast spells while raging. It would be dumb, and it is dumb. And I would much prefer for Hunter's Mark to do less additional damage, if that's the problem, or have some other feature related to it, than keep it what it is and make it impossible for rangers to use the rest of their kit at the same time. That out of the way. Ranger's quite a fun class if you like outdoorsy things and outdoorsy people. They have subclasses that allow them to have animal companions, which is great fun, don't get me wrong, absolutely love it. And they have other subclasses that make them a little more roguelike. They've gained the use of expertise much more, so they are more of a skill monkey than they used to be, which lets them fulfill the role traditionally employed by a rogue. As an archer, they get a bunch of really interesting features. Swift Quiver, a level 5 spell, is only available to rangers these days, and just as in Tasha's Cauldron, they now have the ability to turn invisible, which allows them to make their attacks without being seen and gives them advantage. The Lightning Arrow and Hail of Thorns spells, which trigger in an area around where you hit with your arrow, are now no longer concentration. meaning that they function a little bit like a Paladin's Divine Smite but with a saving throw, allowing you to boost your damage by using up spell slots. So it is an effective build, and depending on what subclass you go for will change the way in which it's effective. Hunter is great if you just want to boost your use of arrows. They get a feature which lets them hit additional targets next to the first one, but their high level feature that used to let them target loads of enemies in the same area has now just become another slight buff to Hunter's Mark. Gloomstalker's great for people that want to track their enemies into dark places and use mind powers and fear effects to debilitate them. But again, they've been slightly debuffed, so their level 3 feature, which used to give them an extra attack that dealt extra damage on the first turn of every combat, now only triggers twice a day and is just a small damage boost. But the good news is that Beastmaster's as good as it's ever been, and Fey Wanderer is pretty much unchanged. So if you want maximum versatility out of your Ranger build, I suggest taking one of those, either giving you an extra ally to run in and assault your enemies in combat. I highly recommend getting the Sharpshooter feat so you don't have to worry about your beast providing cover for your enemies. Or giving you loads of teleport abilities and allowing you to add your wisdom to charisma checks, which combined with the new expertise can make you a really useful face character, in addition to your behind-the-scenes exploration skills. Technique-wise, I'd have a Ranger rely quite heavily on instinctive shooting from a quiver, so that between each shot they have a free hand to be able to do any climbing, animal commanding, or spell casting that they need to do, while still allowing them a relatively speedy return to make 2 attacks within 6 seconds. They probably don't do it by the book, but something like a Slavic draw, or even a reverse draw, are going to be the kind of thing that you'd see them using.
But if Ranger's just not edgy enough for you, you could always try a Rogue.
Rogues are either complete edgelords or cheeky scams with very little middle ground, and they are, in many people's minds, the other archer class. And while they don't really have any features that require bows, if most of your stick is making attacks from behind cover and surprising your enemies, you probably want to be a little distance from them while you do it. Their bread and butter is sneak attacks, powerful hits that deal additional damage to targets that are either distracted fighting other opponents or against whom you have advantage. And they've received several big buffs to that feature. One is steady aim, which is now a part of the core class and allows them to gain advantage by standing still, taking their time, and making a careful aimed shot, which allows them to make sneak attacks without hiding at the cost of decreased mobility. The other buff to the sneak attacks is Cunning Strikes, where you sacrifice some of the sneak attack damage in exchange for an additional effect. The 2 subclasses which I particularly like for archers out of the new set are Assassin and Thief, and they have very different vibes. Thief gains bonuses to their ability to hide, as well as their ability to climb and jump. Assassins, on the other hand, gain additional damage bonuses at the start of combat, and they're able to use their steady aim without having to stand still, which actually makes them prime candidates for not having to hide. Meaning that out of all of the classes, with their high damage single attacks that are quite slow, they're probably the most likely to use the warbow style techniques that aim for a really long draw, like Kyudo or English warbow archery. Although you might expect them to do it from some non-standard locations. Of all the classes, the rogue's probably also one of the ones most likely to use trick arrows, with blunt arrowheads, poison tips, and tangling rope arrows, all featuring heavily in their repertoire. But if chaos is more your thing, perhaps you'd prefer Sorcerer. Sorcerer is an interesting one. These are magic users with an innate ability that manifests through their lineage. So unlike, say, wizards later on, they don't learn their magic from a book, they just have it. And I think that can be manifested in how we make our archery build as well. One of the cantrips available to Sorcerer is of course True Strike, which allows us our once per turn reasonably decent bow attack as our cantrip of choice. We're going to spend the rest of the time casting obscenely damaging powerful magics and blowing things up. The new Wild Magic Sorcerer, much like the old one, has the ability to give themselves advantage on a d20 test, allowing your archery attacks to just be that bit more accurate. After you've done so, it now comes back, just as before, after the next time you roll a Wild Magic search, but that wild magic surge is automatically triggered by the next leveled spell that you cast. Meaning, if you want to absolutely spam that advantage, you can make your shot. Immediately cast Misty Step, Expeditious Retreat, or even have something like Shield in your bank, which will trigger some random magic, possibly including Fireball, possibly turning you into a potted plant, and possibly triggering a whole bunch of other effects. But with the new Wild Magic Surge table being a little bit less vindictive than the old one, it's a random chance that if you enjoy chaos, it's going to be very fun to play. You still aren't going to be as effective with your bow as you would be with basically any of your other magic, but it's free, you can make it accurate, and the rest of the time, you can change the nature of reality with powerful magic. Technique-wise, sorcerers have no martial training, and they don't learn their magic from a book, so there's no particular reason why they would have learned their archery from one either. They're running it off their charisma, which in their world is essentially the way in which they just change reality. So expect the sorcerer to be doing all of the sins that you see in cinema and fantasy and bad drawings. They'll have the string the wrong way on the bow. They'll do that thing where they let go of the bow instead of the arrow. They'll completely fail to nock it and pull it back with something like this. They'll be holding it at a stupid angle on the string, and sometimes they'll just completely forget to use an arrow at all and just pull back and release. All these things are terrible ideas in real life, but when you can bend the nature of reality, somehow it all just works. And if you like that flavor, but you want it to be a bit smarter, then let's go for a wizard. Like the sorcerer, wizards are powerful magic users capable of bending reality to their whims. Unlike the sorcerers, wizards try and be at least a little bit smart about this. In theory, frequently learning and inscribing their magic in a book, it seems reasonably likely that if they do any archery, they've learnt it the same way. There isn't a particularly good reason for a wizard to use a bow. Maybe they're trying to hone a different craft and get some experience of the other side of combat. Maybe they're an elf and their parents really wanted them to get into archery. Or maybe they just like the aesthetic. Whatever the logic, we're returning to our tried and tested method of using True Strike to make a bow viable for spellcasters. It's basically just replacing a cantrip, but you get your spellcasting mod to your damage, so it's not awful for a class that's not specifically getting that mod anyway. And if a wizard is going to use a weapon, a bow is probably as good as any because it allows the famously squishy class to stay far away from their enemies and not have to take any damage. Ow. Naturally, we're going to use most of our turns to cast our much more powerful spells, but when it does come time to use the bow, the wizard is going to be very measured, very considerate. Don't say it. They're going to use techniques exactly as described by your archery coach, which I can't really do in this coat, but you get the idea. Very, very careful. And it will look like a manual and feel as awkward as hell. For a subclass, we're going to go for the Diviner, which is the old divination wizard. You're going to stay back, predict things, watch the play of the battlefield from your vantage point, place arrows or spells where needed. And if something happens that you don't like, you're just going to simply yeet one of your portent dice at it and make it turn out the way you expected. I think it pairs very nicely with an Aasimar build because the flight and additional damage lets you squeeze a little more use out of your bow if you need to, and gives this very sort of angelic protector vibe. It would also pair very nicely with the Abjura subclass, which is all about using spells to protect yourself and your allies. So take your pick, have some fun with it, use your spells as your bread and butter, and your bow as your fallback. Now, the more perceptive among you will have noticed that I've missed one out. And partly that's because Wizard and Sorcerer are very similar for this kind of a build, but also because I really wanted to end this with Warlock. Stereotypically, Warlock is the edgelord's edgelord. They've made a pact with the dark force to grant them power to bend the world to their will. However, it's perfectly possible to play as a good Warlock with a celestial patron, or a fairly ambiguous one with a fey patron, or somewhere in the middle. But they also happen to be, in the new version, arguably the best archer build in the game. One of the biggest changes for Warlocks, if you happen to like using weapons, is that you no longer have to play as a Hexblade to get the cool advantage of using your spellcasting stat for your weapons. Anyone with a Pact of the Blade can do it. which makes more or less any subclass viable for an armed Warlock build. The caveat to it is that it has to be a melee weapon when summoned, but you can bond any magic weapon to be your pact weapon. So if you have a magic bow or you find one, then suddenly you're golden and you can start using this build. From there on out, if you take the right invocations, then you get your extra attack, and the Thirsting Blade has been replaced with a third attack. You can cast Hex, which is a concentration spell that works exactly the same as Hunter's Mark, and basically allows you to keep up with the ranger up until you overtake them by getting an extra attack. But you also get access to Eldritch Smites, which let you channel the power of your spell slots through your weapon, which could be a ranged weapon, to deal additional damage to your target, in exactly the same way as a Paladin does, but now you also knock them prone. Subclass-wise, pretty much any of them are viable at this point. If you want to be able to do a load of healing and support spells on top of it, then I recommend going for a Celestial Patron. If you want to be weird as hell and do mind tricks, then I suggest going for the Great Old One Patron. But to be honest, personally, if you spotted the theme running through this, I'm going to go for Archfey, because I cannot resist a bit of teleportation. And with that build now, not only do you get a bunch of free teleports, but you can also add fear effects or different alternative options to them. Of course, they're triggered as a reaction to you taking damage. And all of that's on top of the Warlock's standard features, which include horrific spells, debilitating effects, and slots that restore on a short rest. But I also think that when it comes to visualization, the Warlocks present a fascinating opportunity. Because by using charisma and by having all of their ability to use the weapon connected to it being a pact weapon, they can't use one. If you were to just give this Warlock a random bow, they'd pick it up, they'd hold it kind of weirdly, and they'd spend a little while trying to figure out how to use it based on what they know. But when they use it in combat, they are channeling the knowledge of their patron of how to use that weapon. And because none of their patrons are humans, that could look really weird. They might be the only class, for example, that can consistently just shoot 3 arrows at once and hit 3 separate targets. Not because they're doing it through sheer skill, but because they just haven't learned that that's not how it works for most people. They might not use any speed shooting techniques at all and shoot really slowly and carefully, but then at the end of 6 seconds you realize they've shot 3 arrows and you don't know how. Their arrows might wiggle and fishtail in the air, or sprout wings and fly towards the target, or just vanish in a flash of light and reappear where they're meant to hit. It's all going to depend on the nature of their patron and the connection they have to them, and I think that presents some really awesome opportunities for creating fun archery visuals. The biggest limitation of this build compared with Ranger or Fighter, or frankly even Paladin, is that you don't have access to the fighting style feats, so you won't be able to get that extra +2 to your accuracy with a bow. But slap some Devil's Sight and some Darkness and you've got an advantage on every single attack, so you won't exactly miss it. So if you're looking for a build that's effective with its bread and butter use of a bow, but also versatile and has some exciting additional options, I really cannot recommend the Warlock highly enough. Just make sure you actually get on with your DM, otherwise their patron will absolutely shaft you. And that's it, 12 classes and 12 archer builds using the new 1D&D rule set. One thing that some of you will have noticed that I missed earlier on is talking about fighting styles. The fighting style feats are now only available to classes that have a fighting style at base, so Fighter and Paladin and Ranger. And all of those classes, including Paladin, get access to the Archery fighting style, which gives you a +2 to all of your ranged weapon attacks. So you can be a lot more accurate, and it does make the Paladin more viable than I assumed earlier on. That said, when it comes to ranking the Archer builds from D through C, B, A, and S for the top tier, then I'm still going to place Paladin down in D, simply because it lacks the versatility and the options to be able to use a bow effectively. And Barbarian is also going to sit down there too, with the option of bumping it up to a C if you go for Zealot Barbarian, because at least they get a chunky amount of damage to go on their bow. Sitting up there with it in C is Wizard, because they really don't have much reason to use the bow. Sorcerer's somewhere on the borderline between C and B. It's a little bit higher up just because of the sheer wackiness of that build and the fact that they are getting advantage on the reg, but damage-wise it's still pretty low, and so they would be much better just using regular cantrips in a lot of cases. Moving up to B, we've got Cleric and Druid, and I'm also going to stick Monk in there for now. If we get a better Kensei, then Monk will bump right up to A or potentially even S. Sitting up at A ranking, I'm going to put Rogue and Ranger because they're both very, very effective builds, but the Rogue lacks a bit of the excitement of some of the others, and the Ranger just doesn't compete with Warlock on the same things that the Ranger's meant to be good at. So despite their extra accuracy coming from their fighting style, they are sitting a little bit lower, but right at the top, we've got Bard, Fighter, and Warlock. All of them can get 3 or more attacks a turn on the regular. All of them have additional features that can make their bow attacks deal either extra damage or have extra utility, and all of them have some access to things that give them either mobility or survivability. So there it is. Those are my favorite archer builds. Go out, find your own, and let me know down below which ones you've enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you like my content and you'd like to see more, please remember to like and subscribe. If you want to support these videos and help me make more of them, please check out my Patreon down below. Or if you want to learn archery from me, look at the College of Arrows, which is a series of online tutorials taking you from beginner level up to more advanced and silly tricks. And of course, thank you very much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. If you like writing fantasy or running games, then do give them a click.